Mark Hertling. I talked to your teacher through a social media network, just volunteered because I like speaking with young people, hopefully influencing them in a way that will help them see how our government works, how our military works. A little bit of an introduction about myself. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, had never left the city of St. Louis or had never been on an airplane until I got on a plane to go to the U.S. Military Academy when I was 18 years old. Because I grew up in a family that was relatively lower income, didn't have the opportunity or the money to go to college. And I had a high school guidance counselor who pulled me aside one day and said, "Hey, look, we know you don't have a whole lot of cash to go to school, go to college, but there's this place in New York called West Point, and if you go there, if you get accepted and get into the place, you'll be able to get a 4-year education, and all you have to do is give back 5 years of your life to the Army." It sounded at the time to be a pretty good deal. This was back in 1971. Yes, I know I'm dating myself now, being an old guy. But I was class of 71 in high school, class of 75 from the military academy. And since then, instead of just giving back 5 years to the military, because I just truthfully like the people, like the adventure, like traveling all over the world. Before going to West Point and going into the Army, as I said, I'd never left the city of St. Louis. Now, by my wife and I, by our last count, we've been to 119 different countries. And I've had the opportunity to dine with soldiers and presidents and kings and queens and had engagements with other governments and as well as serve our nation. I left the Army in 2012 as a 3-star general. My last job was commanding all the U.S. forces in Germany, or in Europe, actually. I was stationed in Germany. I've spent 3 years in combat. We have 2 sons and 5 grandsons. Our oldest son is a lieutenant colonel in the Army right now. He was stationed in Kansas as what they call the operations officer for the 1st Infantry Division, and he went with them to Poland during the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, and he was there on his 5th overseas deployment. But now the Army has sent him back to get a PhD in international relations from Vanderbilt University, which is a pretty big deal. They only pick a couple of people per year to do that. Our other son works in Washington, D.C. I can't tell you where he works because it's a secret place, and I can't tell anybody where he works. But so one lives in Tennessee and the other one lives in Washington, and my wife and I live in Florida. And if you wanted me to, I could roll the shades of the curtain up, turn my camera around and show you the beach down here, except, well, in fact, I will do that because we're getting ready for another hurricane as it's coming into Florida over the next couple of days. So it's a little cloudy outside. I'll turn the camera around, but that is the view from my office on A1A and on the beach. So if any of you ever want to come down here and take some surfing lessons, I'll try and help you out.
You've got a lot of fans over the beach, General. Everybody's pumped about the beach.
Yeah. Okay. That's probably enough about me. I guess one of the things we want to talk about is our forces in Europe and specifically what's going on in NATO and Ukraine. As the tensions got tough in Ukraine, and I can give you some details about it, but during my last job in commanding forces in Europe, we were training the Ukrainian army as well as many other armies that were part of what we call our footprint. And I spent probably at least a couple of months inside of the country of Ukraine at different places, Kharkiv, Kyiv. One of the big places where we trained soldiers was in a little place in the western part of the country called Yavoriv. And that was where our 2 armies came together, as well as some of the armies of other nations in Europe. But we would do the same thing, didn't get a whole lot of publicity with countries like Romania and Croatia and the Baltic countries. And there are a total of 49 countries in the European footprint. We partnered with about 36 of them. And you might say immediately, how come you didn't partner with all of them? Well, because some of the countries, truthfully, are so small and so little, they didn't have much of an army, like Monaco or the Vatican, or, you know, they all have small security forces. But what we were doing was really building alliances and partnerships with like-minded nations that we could potentially combine with for security services. And truthfully, a lot of the countries that we partnered with were former Warsaw Pact or Soviet bloc countries that were trying to gain more of a republic in terms of their freedoms, because they had been under the rule of the Russians and the Soviet Union for decades, and they were now becoming more of a democratic nation. We can talk about that if you'd like to, too. Like I said, I spent 3 years in combat, a total of 3 years in combat, all of it in the Middle East, a little bit in South America during the early stages of my career when we were doing counter-narcotics fights in Colombia. I spent some time in Colombia in an area called the Dog's Head, where a lot of the drug cartels hung out. But most of my 38 years in the military was spent in Europe. 12 of my 38 years were spent in Europe, and I have more of a feel for that continent than any of the other ones. Although I did spend a little bit of time in Korea, and I had a 2-week trip to China in the late 1990s as part of being a student at the War College. My favorite things to do, I was a college swimmer and water polo player. I'm a huge bicyclist now. I cycle when I'm not injured about 30 to 40 miles a day early in the morning. But last August, I had a really bad cycling accident during a race, broke my femur, the upper part of my leg, in 5 places, and tore a couple of muscles. So I'm still recovering from that, believe it or not. I just had a second surgery about 3 weeks ago. So you can't see it, but I've got a tie and a shirt on the top, but I got gym shorts and my leg propped up with an ice bag on it on the bottom. So I'll stop there and we'll start conversation on whatever you all want to talk about. And there are no questions off limits. I'll talk about anything.
Perfect. Thank you, General. So we have a couple of, I mean, do we want to start? I know we had some students had prepared some questions ahead of time, but then we've got some last minute students. So they'll, I'm sure, probably, hopefully have a couple questions for you as well. Does anybody want to start and come up and introduce yourself to the General and ask your question? General, come on up.
I volunteer myself as tribute.
As tribute, we've got a first volunteer. So introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Daniele. I was not born in the United States. I was born in Brazil. I have lived.
Boa tarde. Boa tarde, señorita.
Boa tarde.
Obrigado.
Huh?
Obrigado.
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 Oh. Like, you don't have the accent.
Okay, sorry.
So I'm honestly very curious about what's happening in the Ukraine, and then I have a couple questions. Well, 3 in total, actually. What do you think the outcome will be in regards to the war?
Do you want to ask all your questions and I can just kind of all combine them?
Yeah.
Ask me a couple more.
Do you think the war will end with Ukraine winning or Russia? Is there a chance Putin and the rest of the Russian oligarchy might be dead at the end of this war?
Yeah. Okay. I'll address that and kind of expound on it a little bit. From the beginning of the conflict, truthfully, I did not think Russia would invade. And I'll give a little bit more of my background. Having been in Europe on a daily basis as the commander of forces, I would get a book on my desk from my intelligence guys, which we call the Black Book. And it would have all sorts of secret documents and new reports from the CIA or the Defense Intelligence Agency or some of our intelligence capabilities in different countries. And it would be generated by country. There would always be a section on the different countries that were part of the footprint in Europe as well as a worldview. For the last, starting in about 2004, we detected the beginning of a deterioration of the Russian military as well as the Russian government. It was turning into an authoritarian kleptocracy. In other words, a dictator that had a criminal state. What we were seeing in the military, not only from our intelligence sources, but I was personally observing it because I went to Russia several times to do exercises with Russian military, to observe some of their schoolings, to speak at one of their schools one time in Moscow. And what I detected was a very different army in 2004 through about 2012 than we had seen earlier in the Cold War days of the 1980s, 1990s. It was terrible. Their generals became crooked. They had no young sergeants or lieutenants who were capable. Their equipment was totally bad. A lot of problems with their tanks and their BMPs and even their rifles. They just did not have a very good army. Their training was obsolete. They did not do the same kind of training that most Western countries did. At the same time, having spent the last 4 years of my career with Ukraine, and watching them develop from an old Soviet-style army to a more modern, Western, technologically advanced army, even though the Ukrainian government still had a lot of problems with corruption. What I saw in Ukraine was a very dedicated, high morale force that were prepared to defend their country, their culture, their people. So I was actually on CNN. I think Ms. Stefani probably told you that I'm a CNN analyst. And on the very first day of the war, I was on one of the shows, and everybody was saying, oh my gosh, the Russians have so many forces out there, they're going to completely overwhelm Ukraine. And I said, yeah, no, I don't think so. I think Ukraine's going to win this. And it shocked. In fact, I think I was on with Anderson Cooper, for those of you who know who he is. And it shocked him. He said, how can Ukraine stand up to the second largest army in the world? And I said, because there's more to an army than just their numbers. And even with their numbers, what they have surrounding the country of Ukraine getting ready to attack, it's not enough to do what they want to do. So early on, I think it was on February 25th, I wrote an article about how Ukraine would win the war. And everything, and I'm not saying this to brag, but everything I predicted would happen has actually happened in different phases of the conflict. The only thing that has surprised me, truthfully, is not how bad the Russian army was. It's not how good the Ukrainian army is. The only things that surprised me was the criminal and illegal war crimes being executed by the Russian military across the board. I still have a lot of friends in Ukraine, and they continue to report to me how devastatingly horrific the Russian criminal activity is by bombing, and you've seen this on the news, but by bombing and striking apartment complexes, abducting children. There's now an indication that there's close to 800,000 Ukrainian children that have been taken out of Ukraine into Russia without their parents. The amount of war crimes, of murders, rapes, torture is just, it's beyond what anybody can imagine. It goes back to something you would read about in history books in the 16th century of raping, looting, murder, torture, and it's just horrific. There's no other way to say it. That has been the only thing that has surprised me in terms of how bad the Russian army has approached us in a criminal way. Your other question was, how will this end? I don't know. And no one can tell you exactly how it will end, because it all will only end now, in my view, from decisions made by President Putin. President Zelensky in Ukraine has already said, here are the things I will negotiate on. And the things he said he will negotiate on is a complete regaining of Ukrainian territory and sovereignty, a return of all detained and captured civilians, reparations for all the destruction that Russia has caused on the infrastructure of Ukraine, and estimates now is it will cost something like $40 billion to repair all of the infrastructure of Ukraine, and a criminal court to determine war crimes of not only the soldiers, but also the hierarchy of the Russian government, which means Putin himself. Now, certainly Putin is not going to buy any of that, so he's going to continue to fight. I think what we're seeing now inside of Russia is a continued, an increasing desire for the Russian government to end the war. There are more and more protests every day. Putin doesn't seem to be listening just yet, but he's also running out of soldiers. The count this morning that I just looked at a little while ago said that there have been close to 78,000 Russian soldiers killed on the battlefield. That is more than we lost in 20 years in Vietnam, all the years in Afghanistan and Iraq, and part of the Korean War. So in a 7-month period of time, the Russian army has lost almost 80,000 soldiers. For every 80,000 soldiers, there are hundreds and thousands of parents and brothers and sisters and wives and children who are missing those soldiers back in Russia. And Putin's attempt to mobilize 200,000 more to continue to fight is failing miserably. The morale of the Russian army, from every intelligence report that I've read so far, is in the toilet. And they just do not want to fight because they don't feel like they have either the leadership or the equipment to do so. So that's a very long answer to your question in terms of how I see the state of the war. I think what we are going to see in the next couple of months, and a lot is going to depend on what happens during our elections today, which is why it's so critically important to vote, is there are some in our government who say we want to stop support of the Ukrainian government. And I personally, my personal belief is it is in our interest to continue to support them, not only from the standpoint of countering the kind of actions that Russia is having, but it also, by continuing to support them, we are also sending a signal to other autocrats around the world like China and North Korea that say, don't attack your neighbors. I will stop there. That's a very long answer, but thanks for the question.
Thank you, General. I'm going to bring someone else up. Jay, you want to come on up? Come on up. Introduce yourself.
Okay. My name is Jade Ferreira, and I have 2 questions.
Okay.
The first one is, what has been the most valuable lesson you learned thus far during the war? And then the second one is, how has the Ukrainian war affected your political views?
Yeah, the most valuable lesson to me is just reinforcing something I always knew, and that is leadership is critical. You know, how your leaders act and contribute to doing the right things is why Ukraine is leading today, is winning today. They have good leaders at the top of their government. They have good generals who are great leaders, who I know many of them. And they have good young sergeants and lieutenants who are leading troops in the front line. Russia has none of that. So as a soldier, as a former soldier in the US Army, what I'll tell you is we spent a significant amount of time learning the intricacies of leadership. And it changes at every level that you're in. So when I was a brand new graduate of West Point as a second lieutenant, the leadership lessons I started to learn as a tank platoon leader with my 19 soldiers stationed in Germany in 1975 were that you take care of people, you ensure their equipment is up to date, you hold them to right standards, you make sure they do the things they're supposed to do, you care for them and truthfully love them as they're part of your family. And there's a bunch of other lessons, but you exhibit what are called the attributes of leadership: character, a set of personal values, a vision for what you want to do, a mission statement on the kinds of things that you want to accomplish, and your behaviors should reflect what you believe in. And you should learn how to communicate well. You should learn how there are different methods of communication depending on the situation. That was what was taught to me both at West Point and in my days as a second lieutenant. But as I rose through the ranks of the military to become a general, at each level, it gets harder and harder because your organizations grow. I mean, when I was brand new as a second lieutenant, I had 19 tankers in my tank platoon. My last job in the Army, I had over 100,000 soldiers that I was responsible for. So different things, you learn different things from the standpoint of leadership that help you contribute to the success of the organization. So that's what what I've learned from the war so far. The second thing I've learned from the war is that training is critical. You have to ensure the people who are asked to do what they're going to be asked to do, they're trained in it. I mean, you all are in school right now, you're learning different subjects. All of that is contributing to you being a person within the society that can actually give something to the people around you. So it's important to learn the lessons that you learned. That's true in the classroom, and it's true in the training fields of the military. Your second question, has it changed my political views? I think I would say it's only reinforced my views in terms of really focusing on what right looks like and what we as a nation are all about. We as a nation are about respecting one another, understanding that everyone contributes in their own unique way, that all people are valuable, that we should not only have freedoms, but we should also have an understanding that we should be civil and that we should treat everyone as a person of value. When I don't see that happening in the political landscape, it just kind of tells me that we're running counter to what our founding fathers said we should do. One of the things we do as military officers and as members of the government is we take an oath to support the Constitution. We take an oath. And the oath, in fact, I've memorized it because I've said it so many times. It goes something like this. I, Mark Hertling, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will obey the orders of the President and the orders of the officers appointed over me, and that I will abide by all the regulations and duties according to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, so help me God. Now, that's a long oath, but everyone in government takes that. And yet some people don't live up to that oath. And that upsets me because our oath is based on something that, this isn't something new. This is an oath that George Washington wrote in 1793. So it's something that dates back through our history, and it's a determination that we will, and it makes us, the other thing, and I hate to keep going on long-winded about this, as I used to travel around to different countries, I would ask soldiers of other armies what they vowed an oath to. And the soldiers in other armies would say, oh, we vow to protect the motherland or the fatherland or El Presidente or the king or the queen. The Israeli army says they vow to put themselves between the people of the sea and the sea, which is one of the more unique oaths. But we're the only army in the world, we're the only government in the world that vows to defend a piece of paper. And in that piece of paper are the ideas and values of our nation. So that makes us somewhat unique in all the other countries of the world. And you ask, how have my politics changed? My politics haven't changed. I've always been an independent. I've always voted for the person that I think is going to contribute most to society and the government. But what has changed is what I've seen others do that I don't like all that much.
Thank you, General.
Yeah.
Other questions? Come on down. Introduce yourself. Ask some questions.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Sophie. Hi, my name's Sophie. I have one question for you about the war, and then I have one question for you about yourself.
Okay.
So, my first question is, do you think that Russia will expand its invasion and go anywhere else in Europe? And what um what was like the hardest thing you remember about adapting to military life?
Okay, on the first question, I think early on, Russia had a plan to expand into other countries. I think they were going to try and expand into the Balkans. I'm sorry, the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. I thought there was a potential for them to try and bite off a piece of Moldova, which is right at the, if you look at a map, Moldova is the southwest bordering country of Ukraine, and it's between Ukraine and a NATO country, Romania. And there is a small slice of land in Moldova called Transnistria, which no American has ever heard of. But they've had what's called a frozen conflict there for many years, where there's a lot of Russians that live in that small slice. And Russia feels like they should take that part of Moldova over again. And I also think there was a potential that Russia would go further into the nation of Georgia. They have two small frozen conflicts in Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And I think had they been successful in Ukraine, they would have tried to completely take over all of Georgia. But truthfully, they don't have the capability to do that now. Their army has been wrecked. I mean, they've been mauled in a big way. In my view, the Russian military capability right now, you know, they went into this as the second largest army in the world, or excuse me, this allegedly the second best army in the world. Today, they're not even the second best army in Ukraine. It's kind of an inside joke, but they're just terrible. They've lost so much stuff. So no, I don't think there's anything that would cause Russia to expand their strategy to go into other countries. And they also see that there's so many nations countering their activity that they wouldn't dare do it now. The hardest thing for me to adapt to in the military, yeah, I guess the toughest thing is just working for different people every 2 years. You know, every 2 years we change jobs. So you have to get to know new bosses, new people. You know, you get thrown into new environments. My wife and I went, you know, I spent 38 years in the military. My wife and I had been married the whole time. We're still married. But in 38 years in the military, we moved 27 times. So imagine, you know, and she grew up in a town in Long Island where she stayed in the same house all of her life until she was dumb enough to marry me. And then I took her all over the world. So just moving from place to place and getting resettled, making a new house or a new set of quarters into a home, and what that does to your kids too. I mean, like I said, we have two boys. Our oldest son went to 4 different high schools. You know, our youngest son went to 6 different grade schools as we moved around, just by happenstance. So they're pretty tough kids too in terms of moving. So that would be the toughest thing about adapting to the military. But I would also say it's part of the adventure too. You never stay in one place long enough for people to find out all the bad things about you.
Thank you. Other questions? Even from you guys. If you guys have questions, he's willing to take any questions you have. I know last night someone on Twitter was joking about what it's like to drive a tank around. And I'm curious definitely about that. Are you guys curious about what it's like to be like driving a tank and stuff?
Okay.
So maybe you could answer that one while a couple of these kids maybe get some thoughts and get less shy.
Well, it's I don't know if I should say this to this class because you're all a bunch of young people, but it's almost as good as sex, to be honest with you. But not quite. What I'll tell you is a tank weighs 70 tons. That's a lot of pounds. It's inside the driver's, there's 4 crewmen in the tank. So there's what we call the driver's hatch, where the driver sits. And inside it, it's not a steering wheel, it's like a motorcycle handle. So you turn to increase the speed, and you have just one pedal and it's a brake. The engine on an M1 tank, the kind of tank I was in, an M1A1, is very different than what you see the Russians driving or the Ukrainians driving today. They are T-72s, T-60 tanks. They have a diesel engine. They throw out a lot of smoke. They can be fast if they're on a road. And when I say fast, they can go maybe 30, 40 miles an hour. But when you talk about, you know, a 50-ton vehicle, which a T-72 is, going 40 miles an hour, that's a lot of momentum, and it can knock down a lot of things. A US M1A1 tank has a 1,500 horsepower jet engine, not a diesel engine, but a jet engine. It takes jet fuel. It can go upwards. It's governed, which means, you know, most tankers can't drive it faster than 60 miles an hour. But if you were to take the governor off, it could go on a European highway probably close to 80 miles an hour, and it's 70 tons. So it is quick. The driving of it is relatively easy. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story. My wife, when I was a battalion commander, we had 120 tanks in my battalion. And one of the young lieutenants asked my wife if she had ever driven a tank, and she said no. And so they arranged for her to go to the motor pool and get inside of a tank and drive it. And she took about 30 minutes of a lesson and then started driving it around the motor pool. And much to my dismay, she drove it a little bit too fast, but that's a whole nother story. So it's easy to drive. The hard part inside the tank is not what goes on in the driver's hatch, but inside the turret, which is where the gun is, you have a gunner, a tank commander, and a loader. So every round that goes off, you have to load manually. And I've got an old empty tank round around here somewhere without the head of it. But each one of those tank rounds weighs about 70 pounds. And you're trying to get as many shots as possible off as you can. So the guy that is the loader, the guy or the gal now, we have women in the Armor Corps now, who's loading the tank, has to be able to pull a round out of a rack, throw it into the gun, lock it up, and then get out of the way. Because when the gun fires, it recoils about 3 feet. So you can't be in the way because it recoils with a lot of power. The gunner has the capability, it's very high tech. It measures everything. You have a laser rangefinder. It can, you put the laser on a target up to about 4 miles away, and it will return the distance to the target and raise the gun automatically so you can hit that target at 4 miles. It's like if you were aiming a weapon, you would give it windage or, you know, lead a target or something like that. A tank does that all automatically based on the training of the gunner. It also has a device that measures wind velocity, so it accounts for that when it shoots the round. There's a lot of high-tech stuff inside the turret of the tank, and the tank commander, who is up in the top, he's not only shooting the main gun, which is huge, but he also has 3 different machine guns inside of a tank to shoot too. So it is a very well-coordinated crew that fires the tank. But driving is pretty fun. I kiddingly on Twitter, Ashley, you saw this last night, I mentioned Joel Stein. There's a guy named Joel Stein who's a comedian and an author. He's written a bunch of books. And he wrote a book called Man-Made, My Insane Struggle for Masculinity. And what he did is his wife and him had a kid, a young boy, a child, and he wanted to be the best father he possibly could. So the intent of the book is he went around to a bunch of things that said, how do you make yourself manly to give a good example to your son? So one of the things he did, he contacted me. I knew this guy from before. He talks about this in the book. And we invited him to one of our Army bases to fire a tank. And he got up early in the morning, came out there, and he was all fired up. And he was so nervous that he literally fainted before he climbed into the tank. So he was very embarrassed. That's not very manly. You know, the first sight of a tank, he fainted because he was so nervous going into the thing. But that's a whole nother story.
Perfect. Thank you. Questions from Mr. Librera's group that you're just coming up with? Sam, come on. You don't have one? Other question? You got a question? You don't want? We've got a lot of shy kids. Luckily, I printed out a bunch of their questions, having a feeling some of them would get shy.
Okay.
I'm going to combine two of them here. Have there been any major strategies that have helped Ukraine keep fighting Russia this whole time? And what are your thoughts on Ukrainian President Zelensky? How has his leadership impacted the war?
Yeah. Ukraine, when I first ran into Ukrainian soldiers, it was in 2004 in Iraq. And they were a terrible army. They hadn't started changing. Their government was extremely corrupt. They had a black market on the government. And so a couple of real patriots in the Ukrainian army said, we're going to change our military, we're going to change our government and make it more Western in its approach. So starting in about 2006, 2007, they asked the US Army in Europe to help them transform their army. So their strategy was to truly go away from Russia and the Soviet model that they had used and become a Western style army. There was my counterpart in the Ukrainian army was a guy named Colonel General Vorobyov. He has since died. He died of cancer a couple of years ago. But he and I developed a plan, a strategy to answer that question on what it would take to change the Ukrainian military. And we developed that plan in 2010. And it had to deal primarily with how do you change the training? How do you build sergeants' corps? How do you improve the training of your lieutenants? And how do you get rid of the old Soviet officers that are the colonels and the generals of the army? Because he wanted to do that. And he had grown up in the Soviet army too, but he just said, I don't want the Ukrainian army to be like the old Soviet army. So for a period of about 4 years, we worked on that. And then I left, I retired. He continued on in the Ukrainian military. And in 2014, Russia invaded the eastern part of Ukraine and took over their little small segment of their country called Crimea. Because he had prepared his military with a strategy to defend their country, to defend their sovereignty, they were successful. So that's, I think, over a period of about 10 years, they just completely changed their army. They still, truthfully, have not weeded out all corruption from their government. There is still elements of corruption within the Ukrainian government. But I think President Zelensky, being the kind of leader he is tackling that even while a war is going on. So I think Zelensky exhibits every characteristic of a senior governmental leader that any country would want at the head of their government.
Perfect. Thank you. Has anyone gotten the courage to ask a question in the meantime? Do you want me to run the show here? Yeah, voter turnout. All right. So here's a good question. Is anyone in here interested in joining the military potentially? Okay, so we have a couple kids raise their hand saying they're interested in joining the military potentially. Could you speak to what would be helpful for those students to get prepared for that, what to expect, things of that nature?
Sure. One of the things, before my last job commanding the U.S. Army in Europe, my second to last job in the Army was I was actually in charge of all of basic training throughout the country. And every year the Army takes in, well, now it's back then, back in 2009 and 10, when I was in charge of basic training, we were taking in about 160,000 new soldiers every year. I think that number is now down to 130,000. And the reason why is because in 2009, we were fighting in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And right now, we don't have the requirement for that many soldiers. So when I took over basic training, what we saw was a couple of things. Number one, our training, the Army's training was somewhat outdated. So we completely revamped our training to address modern challenges that we were facing throughout the world. But the second thing we saw, truthfully, was the fitness level of our youth. It's, you know, I will share a fact with you that, and there's no easy way to say this, but the military can only accept about 23% of our nation's 18 to 24-year-olds. And you say, well, why is that? Well, the reason is, number one, the majority don't have a high school education. There are some who have criminal records, and they're either in very bad shape, overweight to a certain degree, or obese. The obesity epidemic in the United States is really affecting your generation and the generation before you, the Generation Zs and Xs. So what we found in most recruiting offices was when a young civilian, you know, an 18-year-old came into the recruiting office, they wanted to join, but they weren't in shape. And yes, the Army or any military branch will get you in shape, but you got to come in at a certain level of fitness before we can even start, or there will be a lot of injuries associated with your training. And that's one of the things that we were seeing. So the first thing that I would recommend to anyone that's considering going into the Army is, number one, start getting in shape. Start eating right, start getting more sleep at night, and start working out. The second thing I would say is understand that you can do anything. And I'm going to talk specifically the Army, because this isn't true of all forces. The Army is the biggest service. We take in about 130,000 new soldiers every year. The other three services, Air Force, Navy, and Marines, can be much choosier about their recruitment, because all three of them combined take in less than 100,000 a year. So if you go into an Army recruiting office, we will talk to you, say, hey, what do you want to do? Here are the things we can offer you. Here's what you need to get in shape. If you go into a Marine recruiting office and you're out of shape and you want to do certain, they'll just tell you, no thanks. We're all filled up. Thank you very much. Go somewhere else. The Air Force is more high tech. So is the Space Force. The Navy is different as well. But, and I'm not being biased against those other services. I'm just telling you how it is in terms of numbers and what we try and recruit. If you come into the Army, there are, I think the last time I looked, there were 219 what we call MOSs, military occupational specialties. In other words, jobs. You can be anything from an infantryman to a tanker like I was, to a military police person, to an engineer, to a bandsman. If you play a musical instrument, you can join the military to be in a band, to a logistician, a truck driver, if you want to drive a big rig. I'll never forget one time I was at a basic training site and I met this little woman who was about 4'8". She was the smallest soldier I ever saw. And I said, what are you going to do? What's your MOS going to be? And she goes, sir, I'm going to drive big rigs. So she wanted to just come in the military to train to drive huge trucks that the military has. You can do anything you want. You can be an intelligence specialist. You can go off after you serve and be an officer. But there was another there was another story. I was having lunch with a bunch of soldiers at Fort Lee, Virginia, which is where our logistics school is. And I was having the soldiers around the table tell me what their skills were, their MOSs were. And I knew most of what they were. So like if you say, I'm a 92 whiskey, that means a 92W. That means you're a medic. You're a combat medic, so you're trained in first aid. Well, I got to this one woman, this young girl, and I said, what are you training for? Her name was Prowl. I'll never forget that, Jennifer Prowl. And I said, what are you training for? And she said, sir, and she proudly said, sir, I'm a 92 Mike. And I didn't know what a 92 Mike was. And I said, what's the Mike identifier, 92M? And she said, sir, that's a mortician specialist. And I said, what? And she goes, yeah. She said, I'm a mortician. I'm an Army mortician. So I said, and she didn't, I mean, she looked like a normal 18-year-old. I said, why did you choose that career field? Is your dad a mortician, or do you have some kind of interest? And she said, no. She watched a movie called Taking Chance. And it's a movie with Kevin Bacon. And it's about this soldier that dies in Iraq and how he is transferred from Iraq all the way back to his hometown in North Dakota or someplace, and how the Army morticians take care of his body the whole way. And she said to me, she said, I just couldn't see anything more honorable than being someone that took care of soldiers' bodies. And so she joined the Army to be a mortician. Now, what I'll tell you is, after she graduated, to continue the story, I told her, Sergeant Major, I said, hey, let me know what happens to Prowl as she continues on. Well, she graduated from basic training. She went off to a unit, and on the first week she was with her active unit, her operational unit, the first sergeant came out and asked for volunteers to go to Haiti because they had just had an earthquake there. This was, I think, in 2010 or 11. And so she was a volunteer to go to Haiti. And in her first 2 months as a soldier, she took care of close to 1,000 bodies, deceased bodies in Haiti. Now, I'm sure there's probably none of you in the room that want to be a mortician, but the fact that she was able to do that as a 19-year-old in her first unit of assignment was heaven to her. I mean, she was able to execute the skills she had learned in the Army. So I guess I'm elaborating too much on this, but I'll tell you two things. Get in shape, and then don't let the recruiter talk you into anything you don't want to do. Go in there with something that you want to do, that you think would be fun, and that would be contributing to what you want to be in your life.
Thank you so much.
Actually, I'm sorry, I'm making these stories too long.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
We have a few minutes left, and I want you to touch on your work with the American Battle Monuments Commission, if you would.
Yeah. President Biden back about a year ago appointed me and 10 other guys and gals to be part of something called the American Battle Monuments Commission. And what that is there are 26 American cemeteries all over the world. And if you were to Google American Battle Monuments Commission, you would see these cemeteries and monuments all over the world. There are close to 144,000 soldiers from World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam that are buried in sites outside the United States. So I'm sure all of you have heard of Arlington National Cemetery. Well, that's here in the United States. That's run by the Veterans Affairs. But all the cemeteries, the 26 cemeteries that are run around the world, are those that the American Battle Monuments Commission runs, as well as a bunch of monuments too. So if you've ever heard of Normandy, France, or today, by the way, is the 80th anniversary of the U.S. entering into Morocco and Tunisia at the start of World War II, there is actually a cemetery with about 7,000 Americans buried in Tunisia, which is right outside of Carthage, a very historic, before Christ town. And it honors American dead. But some of the most beautiful cemeteries in the world. If you're ever visiting a foreign country, you can look on the website and see what the ABMC does. And we basically oversee the care and upkeep of these sites as a continued memorial to all the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who have given their life for our country. And part of the reason is it helps us to message what they've done for the country. And I'll show you something that I have on my desk. And it's a cigar box. It's a wooden cigar box. You can probably see it says "Make It Matter" on the front. And this is something that there's 3 of us that have this, and it's from our time in combat together. And inside this box, I'll try and lift it up and show it to you. Inside this box, there are 253 cards with faces on them. You can see the top layer, and I'll pull a couple of them. And these are the individuals, these are the soldiers, sailors, and airmen, as well as a couple of allies who served under my command in combat. There's 253 of them, and they all were killed in action in combat. So I'll lift this one up. You saw this picture at the very top. And every day I take 2 or 3 of these and kind of reflect on them. But this is a woman, a staff sergeant by the name of Carlita Davis. She was a medic, and she was a staff sergeant, so she was more senior. She was a wife and mother, lived in Alaska. She had 6 kids, I'm sorry, 3 kids. Her children's name were Trey, Theodore, and Tyreek. Her husband was back in Alaska, and one day in 2007, while I was in northern Iraq as her commander, one of her junior medics was sick, so she decided to go on the patrol instead of him and let him stay back on the operating base to get well, and she was killed in action by a sniper. There's another one. I'll just pick this guy. This was a command sergeant major by the name of Eric Cook. A sergeant major is the highest enlisted rank that you can get in the Army. And Eric was well loved by everybody in our unit. And he was a brigade command sergeant major, which means he was the senior ranking enlisted guy in a unit that had about 3,000 soldiers. So on Christmas Eve of 2003, he was out on patrol with some of his guys just to show that he would be with them, and he was leading from the front, and he was killed by an improvised explosive device on Christmas Eve in Baghdad. Now he lived, my wife and I were living in Germany, and his wife was down the street from my wife. So on Christmas morning, my wife had to go to his house along with a chaplain and a casualty assistance officer and say, hey, your husband's been killed in action. There are 253 stories like those in this box where these guys didn't come home. Those are the same kind of things we have in our American Battle Monuments Commission, where our life is dedicated to making sure people know their stories. And like the top of the box says, we make their sacrifice matter. So that's what the ABMC is. And Ashley, thanks for asking. But now I have to go because I have another meeting.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, General. Bye, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys. Keep studying hard. Keep doing good things, okay?
Thank you so much.
You got it. Take care.
You too.